The smiling monsters are watching you. The first time I saw one of them, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been working on my laptop for hours, the only light in the room coming from the blue glow of the screen. I was about to close it when I glanced toward the window and saw it. A figure. It was standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment, just beyond the edge of the streetlight. Its body was shadowy and indistinct, but its face was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not the kind you'd give a stranger in passing. This smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp, like its mouth had been stretched beyond its limits. I stared at it, my heart pounding. For a moment I thought it might be a person, a prank maybe. But the longer I looked, the more I realized there was something unnatural about the way it stood, the way it stared at me without blinking. I closed the laptop and pulled the curtains shut, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the image of that smile stayed with me. The next day, I convinced myself it had been a dream. I told no one. What was there to say? That I'd seen a shadowy figure with a creepy smile standing outside my window? People would laugh, or worse, think I was losing it. I went about my day, trying to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the grocery store, I kept glancing over my shoulder. On the bus ride home, I felt a pair of unseen eyes boring into the back of my head. That night, as I sat in my living room watching TV, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. I froze. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something standing on the other side of the glass. Slowly, I stood and approached the window, my breath shallow. I reached for the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just enough to peek outside. It was there, the same figure from the night before, its face pressed against the glass, its grin impossibly wide. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, it was gone. Over the next few days, the figures started appearing everywhere. At first, it was just one or two, standing at the edge of my vision, on the sidewalk across the street, in the corner of a crowded cafe, reflected in the glass of a shop window. But soon, they began to multiply. They stood in groups now, always watching, their grins frozen in place. They never moved, never spoke, but their presence was suffocating. I couldn't escape them. They were outside my apartment when I left for work, standing silently in the alley as I hurried past. I saw them on the subway, their smiling faces visible through the windows as the train pulled into the station. Even at work, they found me. I'd glance up from my desk and see one of them standing in the parking lot, its head tilted as though it were studying me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was hallucinating, but no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they wouldn't go away. The first dream came on the 5th night. I was standing in an empty field, the sky a deep, unnatural red. The air was thick and heavy, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. The figures surrounded me, their smiles glowing in the dim light. They didn't move or speak, but I could feel their eyes on me, their gaze like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. One of them stepped forward, its grin widening until it split its face in two. Its mouth opened, revealing row upon row of jagged teeth. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. But the worst part wasn't the dream. The worst part was the figure standing at the foot of my bed, its smile gleaming in the darkness. I stopped leaving my apartment after that. The figures were everywhere now, outside my window in the hallway, reflected in every mirror and screen. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel their smiles, burned into the back of my mind. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every time I tried to call for help, the line would go dead, the faint sound of distant laughter crackling through the receiver. I tried confronting them once. I stood at the window and screamed at the figure standing on the sidewalk. "What do you want from me?" It didn't respond. It just tilted its head, its grin stretching impossibly wide, and then it took a step closer. It wasn't until the 12th day that I understood why they were watching me. I was staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind, when I noticed something. My smile. It was wrong, too wide, too sharp. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was becoming one of them. The whispers in the back of my mind, the growing hunger, the way my face felt stretched and unnatural. It all made sense now. They weren't watching me. They were waiting for me. I fought it at first, clinging to what little humanity I had left. But the change was inevitable. My reflection no longer matched my memories. My eyes were too bright, my grin permanently etched into my face. Even my voice had changed, taking on a hollow, echoing quality that didn't feel like my own. The figures didn't stand outside anymore. They were inside my apartment, surrounding me, their smiles no longer menacing but welcoming. I could hear their whispers now, soft and inviting. Join us. You've always been one of us. And deep down, I knew they were right. The final step came when I stopped resisting. The fear melted away, replaced by a strange, euphoric calm. My smile widened, my body dissolving into shadow until I stood among them, my grin as wide and sharp as theirs. I didn't know how much time had passed. Days, weeks, time had become meaningless. I stopped recognizing myself, not just in the mirror, but in my thoughts, my actions. The smiling monsters didn't need to force me to join them. My resistance was crumbling all on its own. I began to feel connected to them. It started as a faint hum in the back of my mind, like static. Over time, it grew louder, clearer, until I could almost understand it, a language made of whispers and emotions, of hunger and patience. When I looked at the figures surrounding me, I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt kinship, and that terrified me. I decided to run. It wasn't rational. I didn't even know where I could go. But sitting in that apartment, surrounded by their grins, waiting for the inevitable, was worse than death. So I packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. They didn't stop me. In fact, they didn't react at all. As I stepped out into the cold, empty street, they simply watched, their smiles frozen, their heads tilting ever so slightly as if to say, "Go ahead, see if it matters." I walked for hours, my feet aching, my breath clouding in the freezing air. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop, not until I was far, far away from them. But no matter how far I went, they were always there. I reached a small town just as the sun began to rise. It was quiet, the streets empty, the houses dark. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then I saw them. They were everywhere, standing in windows, sitting on porches, lurking in alleyways. Every single face was frozen in that same wide, impossible grin. This wasn't just about me anymore. The smiling monsters weren't following me. They were spreading. I stumbled into a diner on the edge of town, my heart pounding. The place looked abandoned, dusty tables, flickering lights, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I collapsed into a booth, burying my face in my hands. My mind raced with questions, with fears, with the growing certainty that I'd never escape. "Rough night?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see a man standing behind the counter, a worn apron tied around his waist. He didn't have the smile. His face was tired, his eyes bloodshot. "You're not like them," I said, my voice trembling. He laughed bitterly. "Not yet." The man's name was Alan. He poured us both a cup of coffee and sat across from me, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "They've been here for weeks," he said, staring into the swirling smoke. "At first, it was just a few, standing in the shadows, watching. Then more came, and more." "Why?" I asked. "What do they want?" Alan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "They don't want anything. They're just waiting." "For what?" "For you." Alan told me something I didn't want to believe. "They're not just following you," he said. "They're part of you. Don't you feel it? That connection? That pull?" I shook my head, denying it even as I felt the hum in my mind growing louder. "You brought them here," Alan continued. "Wherever you go, they'll follow. And when they've consumed everything, they'll take you too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd thought I was running from them, escaping their gaze. But the truth was worse. I was their anchor. I wanted to leave, but Alan stopped me. "If you run, it'll only get worse," he said. "You can't outrun them. You have to face them." "How?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Alan didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a small rusted key. "There's a room in the back. You'll know what to do." I didn't understand, but I took the key anyway. The room was empty except for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw them. The figures stared back at me from the mirror, their grins wide and gleaming. But there was something different now. They weren't just watching me. They were me. Each figure in the mirror was a twisted reflection of myself. My face, my body, my smile. I realized then that the monsters hadn't been following me. They'd been growing inside me. The connection wasn't a curse. It was a transformation, and I was almost complete. Alan's voice echoed in my mind. "You'll know what to do." The mirror shimmered, the figures shifting and writhing as they reached for me, their smiles widening. I could feel the pull, the hunger, the promise of peace if I just let go, if I let myself become one of them. But then I thought about the town, about Alan, about the people who would suffer if I gave in. I gathered the courage, raised my fist, and smashed the mirror. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted version of my face. The humming in my mind stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. When I stumbled out of the room, The diner was empty. The figures outside were gone, their smiles erased from the streets. For the first time in weeks, I felt alone, but I wasn't free. The connection was still there, a faint hum at the edge of my thoughts. The smiling monsters were gone, but I could feel them waiting, watching, just out of sight. And I knew they weren't finished with me. Not yet. I thought it was over. For days, the streets were empty. The shadows were just shadows again, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. I even started to believe that breaking the mirror had saved me. But tonight, I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was soft at first, almost rhythmic, coming from the window beside my bed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to look, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I turned my head. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. My face. The grin stretched impossibly wide, the eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing. But when I turned around, another figure was standing in the corner of the room. It was me again, its smile frozen, its head tilting slightly as it stepped forward. The hum in my mind returned, louder than ever, drowning out my thoughts. I backed into the wall, my chest tightening as more figures emerged from the shadows, each one a perfect copy of me, their grins splitting their faces in half. "Why are you doing this?" I screamed. The figures didn't answer. They didn't need to, because in the corner of my eye, I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. I was smiling. Well, that was pretty much it. I hope you liked the story till then. Bye-bye.